Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. How was your New Year's and how have your New Year's resolution been? Oftentimes, we lost our track of our goals and let the year go by. And this year, we are going to be sticking through our resolutions, gritting our teeth to thrive in this year's resolution and building our self-awareness. In today's episode, we're reflecting ourselves, understanding the life lessons that we can take to be more life-aware. Today, we are joined by Dr. Mark Canada, the 8th Chancellor of Indiana University Kokomo and a renowned professor of English. He is an expert in literature, journalism, and media literacy. He's authored 7 books, including Ben Franklin's Lesson in Life and Edgar Allan Poe, Master of Horror. His work has appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education, American Literary Realism, and more. Mark is a dynamic speaker who shares wisdom from history's greatest thinkers. Today, we're joined by Mark. Hello, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sabrina. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm very thankful that you decided to join our show. Could you give us a little overview of your work and what you do?
Sure. So I've been a literary scholar for many years, and as you said, I've written a number of books about a variety of topics, Edgar Allan Poe and Ben Franklin's Lessons in Life. Much of my work began with my study of the intersections of literature and journalism. I was a journalist before I became a literature professor, and I was very intrigued by some of the connections that were happening, particularly in the 19th century, between literature and journalism. But over the last 5 years or so, particularly since I wrote Ben Franklin's Lessons in Life, which is an Audible original, I became very interested in the ways that literature and history can help us to elevate our lives. And over the last 8 months or so, I have started a learning platform that I call Mind Inclined. And the tagline of that is elevate your mind, your life, and your world. So much of what I write about in my newsletter and what I cover in my podcasts are topics related to how we can learn from literature, history, and language to make our lives better. And Benjamin Franklin and Frederick Douglass are a couple of my favorite authors. They're very good illustrations of that concept.
I see. And I'm quite interested in Mind Inclined. What pushes you to create this Mind Inclined and helping others to pursue their higher selves?
Often we think that literature is something that's entertaining or moving, and it certainly is both of those things. But I have discovered over my many years of reading novels and autobiographies in particular and poetry that there are a lot of lessons there that we can take to elevate our lives. And as I said, Douglass and Franklin are 2 great examples of that. I like to think that I can make changes in people's lives outside of my teaching. Since I became an administrator, I don't have a chance to teach much anymore. But when I give talks like this one, I often reflect on the lessons that we can take away from great writers and great thinkers and figures in history. So I began writing a little newsletter that I come out with every Saturday, and I have people responding to me and reading it. In fact, just the other day, a friend of mine read it and said that it changed the way that he thinks about reflecting on things that happened to him. So I feel that I made a difference in his life, and I hope I'm making a difference in others' lives as well.
I feel like that's a really fascinating pivot where you taught students beforehand and now you're creating these newsletters to help others as well in a different format. And I feel like it's really fascinating. And before we dive further into our topic of the day, we have this segment to get to know you better. And it's what we call Have You Met Mark? All right. So Mark, What is your favorite book?
Well, as an English professor, I've read a lot of books, and it's difficult to choose just one that's my favorite. I'll mention a few that are some of my favorites. My favorite novel is Moby Dick. I've taught it a number of times and read it a number
Ah,
of times as an American literature professor. I have reason to teach that one. It's brilliantly written and profound insights into the nature of man and humans' experience. But I'd have to say, probably my favorite book in terms of inspiring people is Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And as I said, I'm going to be reflecting on that over the course of our conversation. And then Frederick Douglass's narrative of his life as a slave. He actually wrote three autobiographies, and the first one is called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Very inspiring. And I tend to like literature that is inspiring. Now, I've read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's work and studied him and written about him, and lots of other authors too, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Theodore Dreiser and Henry James and Mark Twain and Stephen Crane. I've got lots of favorite writers, but I'm particularly interested in the ones who have lessons that we can take and apply to our own lives, lessons that are inspiring, lessons that provide specific guidance on how we can live our lives. And that's why Franklin's book is one that's particularly, I think, useful and inspiring.
I feel like that's a plenty coming from you. Of course, you're an English professor, and I can't wait to see how you're going to incorporate that into our conversation today. But next question is, what is your favorite movie?
I don't watch as many movies as I do read books, so I'm going to cheat on this one and say that my favorite movie is actually based on a play. It's A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. I can't watch that one enough. I taught it many times back when I was in the classroom. That one is not one I necessarily would say was inspiring in terms of teaching lessons, but it's a deeply moving play. And the one I'm thinking of is the one with Marlon Brando and Vivian Leigh, and both of them, of course, are really powerful actors. So that's my favorite movie.
I've never heard of that one, and that's quite interesting. And are you listening to any podcast at the moment?
I listen to a lot of NPR here in the United States. National Public Radio is my favorite news source. I listen to the audible version of the New York Times. But the one that comes to mind is Hidden Brain. It's an NPR program that deals with the ways that our brains affect our lives in ways that we may not be aware of. And I'm very interested in psychology. I'm not a psychologist, and so a lot of my insights into human nature and human thought really come from my study of literature. But I'm interested in how the brain operates, and sometimes we can get insights of that into the way the brain operates through literature. And that's what I hope I can share in terms of what I've learned from Douglass and Franklin.
I see. The hidden brain. I'll take note of that. And our next question is, do you have a role model?
Well, I'm inspired by Franklin largely because he resonates with me in terms of my own life and how I look at the world. But I think all of us could benefit from having multiple role models. So I'm inspired by my wife and my children, the way they handle adversity, the way they approach the world, their sense of kindness, their sense of devotion to others. So all of my family members have inspired me in different ways. I'm very fortunate to have a wonderful family, and they inspire me as role models.
That sounds wonderful, having a lot of role models in your life, not just Benjamin Franklin, but your wife and your children who influences you to be a better person. That's wonderful, Mark. And is there a course that has inspired you?
The one that comes to mind is a class that I took in American literature when I was a graduate student. And that's really how I came to be very interested in both Poe and Franklin. So when I was an undergraduate at Indiana University a long time ago, back in the 80s, the emphasis was on British literature. So I read a lot of British literature, Shakespeare, Milton, and so on. But we were not required to take any American literature. So it was almost like a twist of fate. When I went to graduate school, I decided I needed to catch up on my American literature since I had a great basis in British, but not so much in American. And as it turns out, I fell in love with American literature with my professor, Richard Rust. He was inspiring to me, and the readings that we did in there really changed the way I looked at literature. And I fell in love with American literature, and that became my specialty.
Wow. And that's how you pivoted from the British literature to American literature. That's very interesting. And today we can start talking about our topic, which is the reflection for resilience and life lessons to thrive in the new year. Can you personally define what is personal resilience?
Sure. Now, before I define it, and I promise I will define it, I'm going to give an example that I think really nicely illustrates resilience from the life of Benjamin Franklin. So as I said, he wrote an autobiography. He began writing it back in 1771 when he was 65 years old. So he had a lot of time to reflect back on his life. And in part one, he reflects a great deal on his life as a young man. Now, sometimes we think of these great geniuses like the Franklins and the Newtons and the Douglases as people who were just born that way. But what's wonderful about Franklin's autobiography is that you see him reflecting on the difficulties that he had, the adversity that he faced, the errors and mistakes that he made, and the lessons that he learned from them. So one that I particularly enjoy is the story that he tells of being offered an opportunity by the person who was then the governor of Pennsylvania. Now, this is before the American Revolution, so it's not a state, it's a colony. But Franklin at the time was living in Philadelphia as a young man. He was about 18 years old. And the governor, William Keith, became aware of Franklin, and he liked the cut of his jib. He thought, boy, this guy really has a lot of potential. I want to help him out. So Keith told Franklin, I'm going to help set you up. I'm going to send you off to England. You sail off to England, you meet some people there. I will give you some letters of credit, which means that he would show the letters of credit, and then the people in England would give him the money he needed, or rather would give him the equipment that he needed, the printing equipment and the ink and so on that he needed to set up his printing business. So remember, Franklin's just a teenager at this point. He gets on the boat, sails across the ocean. He knows nobody there. He has no prospects. He's there simply to use his letters of credit to get the equipment he needs to go back to Philadelphia and set up his printing business. Well, he shows up in England and he asks for the letters from the governor, and there are no letters. So he's stranded in England. He has nothing to purchase his equipment. He has no prospects there, no job, no family, no friends, and he has to cope with this terrible adversity. Now, that would crush a lot of people. But instead, Franklin lands on his feet. He winds up going to work for a print shop there, develops the skills he needs and the confidence, learns a lot of lessons, writes about all of this many years later. When he goes back to Philadelphia, he still is able to set up a printing business after he apprentices for someone else. So the marvel of that story is how Franklin lands on his feet after this incredible setback that I think would have destroyed a lot of people. But that's resilience. I think that really helps to illustrate the resilience that Franklin experienced. And he talks about this, writes about this over the course of his autobiography, one adversity after another. And so I think it's a really great lesson for us to realize that even somebody as great a genius as Franklin faced these adversities, these setbacks, these failures, and was able to recover from it. So that's resilience. It's the ability to recover from an adversity, from a setback, from a failure, from something that might be a traumatic incident that you've experienced. It could be a loss of a family member. It could be a loss of a job, any kind of failure you've experienced. And some people will be devastated by that. It will have a long-standing effect. People with resilience are able to bounce back. And that's roughly what the word means. It goes back to a Latin word that means essentially leaping back. So if you think about an elastic band that is bent, it bounces back into place. That's what resilient people do. That's what a Franklin or a Douglas, those people are able to recover from that adversity, and in some cases become even better because they're able to cope with the adversity. And that elastic band that stretches backwards and then flings them forward, and they actually become even more successful because they are so resilient.
Wow. And I feel like that's a really wonderful perspective, because in terms of rubber bands, they bend and they stretch, as you mentioned, and propel themselves forward. So it really is an image of how we can become and overcome these challenges in lives. And how can reflecting on past experiences strengthen our resilience like Benjamin Franklin does?
Well, reflection is really valuable in any kind of respect in life. If you think about experiences that you have, if you're able to step back and analyze them in kind of an objective way, there are always lessons to be learned. Now, the ones we enjoy are the successes that we enjoy, and then we're able to say, what worked well, I want to do that again. It's more painful to learn from a mistake, from a failure, from adversity, but we can learn from those too. So reflection is incredibly valuable, but we have to know exactly what it is. Reflection is different from something called rumination. So as the psychologists explain it, rumination is dwelling on a past problem or worrying about the future. There's actually neurocircuitry that's involved here in our brains and how they work. We create kind of a rut in our brains, and then the negative feelings, the negative thoughts flow easily through that channel in our brain. So the more we do it, the stronger the negative feelings are. Rumination is not very productive. Psychologists will try to help people overcome rumination because you wind up just digging yourself deeper and deeper, maybe even to the point of despair. Rather than ruminating, what we want to do is reflect. Reflection is different. In reflection, we're thinking about what happened, but we're thinking about what we can do differently the next time. We're trying to learn from the lesson and not simply dwelling on it. A good lesson I think that we can apply to this, there's a psychologist, very famous psychologist here in the United States named Carol Dweck, and she makes a distinction between growth mindset and fixed mindset. All of us experience failures. If you have a fixed mindset in a particular area, then your logic might be, I failed, therefore I don't belong. This is something that's very interesting and very valuable to us in higher education because students come to us, and if they have a failure or two and they have a fixed mindset, then they may not be able to overcome that fixed mindset. And they think, I didn't do well in this test, therefore I don't belong in college, and they drop out. A growth mindset is very different. A growth mindset is one in which someone thinks, yes, I failed, but I can learn from that failure. So reflection takes place when you look at that experience you had. Let's say that it was a poor quiz score early on in your college career. Instead of saying, that's just how I am, I don't belong in college, I'm fixed, my mindset is fixed that this is how I am and I will never change. A growth mindset says, I can always get better. I made a mistake. I'm upset about it. This was a setback. But having had that setback, what can I learn from it? I can actually give an example from my own life. I did very well in high school as a student, and I decided I wanted to study English and journalism when I went to Indiana University back in the 80s. And early on in my career, or in my college career, I took a Shakespeare class. It was my second semester. And I got a low score on a quiz. Now, a fixed mindset would have said to me, that's just how smart you are. I guess you're not good enough to do well in this class. A growth mindset says, where can I go from here? And I still remember vividly, it was a long time ago, but I remember that I decided I was going to read every one of those plays twice. That's a growth mindset, that I look for a way that I could get better.
Wow, that actually left me a bit speechless there. How you overcame this adversities and creating this and explaining to us what rumination and reflection and the difference between it and creating this growth mindset throughout your life by constantly reflecting about your past and finding a way to curate this growth mindset. And I'd like to know, what role does having self-awareness play in our attempt to thrive in the new years or in the future?
It can be really helpful because you have to know yourself and how your brain operates. So if you recognize that you have a fixed mindset, and I should explain that Carol Dweck, the psychologist, makes it clear that it's not as if each person has just a fixed mindset about their entire lives. They may have a fixed mindset about one particular thing, but have a growth mindset about something else. In the world of higher education where I work, a very famous example of this, or a common example of this, is math. You've probably heard people say, I'm just not a math person. That's a fixed mindset. A growth mindset would say, I struggle with math, but I can get better. I'm going to look for ways that I can reflect on the experiences I've had. And then in terms of resilience, when you get bent back, you fling yourself forward. That would be a growth mindset. Another thing you can do in terms of self-awareness is be aware of something that the psychologist Martin Seligman calls explanatory style. This is a fascinating concept. Explanatory style is the way that people think about what happens to them. If they have a failure, one explanatory style is to say that this is personal. I'm just a bad person, or I'm ineffective, I'm a failure, I'm feckless. And people who have that kind of explanatory style, they may also see problems as permanent. So one little slip they think is just going to affect their entire lives. Sometimes people call this catastrophizing. So that
Catastrophizing.
personalization and that permanence and thinking about it's all about them, that kind of thinking can be very destructive. As you can imagine, you can fall into kind of this feedback loop where you're ruminating about that. You think that that one mistake could affect your whole life. Well, it's over now. And again, it's very relevant to the work that I do in higher education. If you have a young person in college and they have that one bad score, or it may be something personal, they got rejected by someone that they asked out on a date. If they turn that into something personal, they bring that all inside. I'm just a failure. I'm always going to be this way. Permanence, personalization, those kinds of things are destructive. So self-awareness means that you're aware that you have those tendencies and you want to try to overcome it. So you change your explanatory style, as Seligman would put it. You change your explanatory style to say, okay, this was a temporary error. This was a temporary failure that I had. This person rejected me, and when I asked her out on a date, I'm going to try and ask somebody else on a date. It's not something that is going to affect me forever, and it's not something that's deeply rooted in me. We all have failures. That's something that we talk about in higher education today. We want people to recognize that failure is common. It's called normalizing failure. If you normalize failure, then people start to understand that it's not just about them. They're not a failed person. It's something that all of us experience. So resilience is overcoming those failures, understanding that failure is a part of life. In fact, I would argue some of the greatest minds probably failed more than the rest of us did because they're so ambitious, because they're always aspiring to do more. So you think about failed experiments that scientists have. I think of Franklin, for example. He nearly killed himself one time when he was experimenting with electricity. That's a lesson to take away from an experience and to make things better in the future. That's resilience.
That's really great, Mark. But oftentimes, right, a lot of people only see the success, especially within the rise of social media. And we often see posts where people are successful and they're flexing their riches and their treasures. And it makes us feel that we're failing in life and we're the only one failing, because all of these people that shows their success only shows that success, and they might not show us the mountains of failure in their life. And normalizing that failure is, I think, a really good mindset for the youth, for us young people, and not catastrophizing like bad scores or horrible stuff that happens in our life. And can you tell? Yeah.
Well, Sabrina, I'm really glad you brought up social media, because people tend to want to showcase what's going well for them. They want to showcase that they got a great grade, or that they were named the homecoming queen, or that they carried the winning touchdown or caught the winning touchdown pass. Of course, we all want to celebrate those things, but the negative repercussions of that are that, especially for young people, they see those things and they assume that if they're not doing those things, they're inferior to the people who are achieving those things. And the reality is that many of those most successful people are failing, and we just don't see the failures. We see the final products. One of my favorite quotations comes from Michelangelo, who said, "If people only knew how hard I worked to gain my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful at all." We see the final product. We see the David, his famous statue. Mm-hmm. We see the Sistine Chapel. We see Franklin's great work in electricity. We see the final plays of Shakespeare or the symphonies of Mozart. What we almost never see is what goes on behind the scenes. We don't see the failures. We don't see the hard work. We don't see the despair and the frustration that some of these people felt. And we need to remind ourselves that all people fail. One of the favorite things that I have about Franklin's autobiography is that he makes a point of talking about those mistakes, talking about the errors he makes along the way. So Franklin was a printer. And in the world of printing back then, if you made a mistake, you could print a correction to it. And the original mistake was called an erratum. It's a Latin word, so plural would be errata. Well, Franklin says in the very first couple of paragraphs of his autobiography that he would live his life all over again if he had the chance, but he'd like to be able to correct the errata. In other words, just like you reprint a book, you can correct all of the mistakes. And he kind of jokingly said, if I could live my life over again, I'd like to correct a few of those mistakes. Well, the point here is that when he tells his story in his autobiography, he shares many of those mistakes so that we see the Franklin behind the scenes. We see the one who failed and made mistakes, and it helps us to identify with him. And we realize that even somebody that successful made mistakes of his own.
And I feel like that's a really great perspective to life, shedding light to these mountains of failures and showing people that it's okay for you to fail and fail and fail to achieve the success. And can you tell me an excerpt of literature that captures the essence of improving oneself in building personal resilience?
Sure. I've talked a lot about Franklin. I'm going to turn to another writer who was probably even more resilient than Benjamin Franklin, and that was the great Frederick Douglass. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Douglass, he's not quite as famous as Franklin, but Douglass began his life as an enslaved man in Maryland, the eastern shore of Maryland. So his life as a slave was there's so much oppression that happens to slaves. He didn't even know when he was born. So speculation is he was born right around 1818, and he lived all the way until 1895. So he lived a long life. But he was able to live that life and succeed in that life because of his incredible resilience. So there are lots of stories I could tell about Douglass. Let me tell just one of them. When he was a child, his mistress at the time was teaching him to read. But her husband learned that she was teaching him to read and told her to stop because the husband understood that education would empower a slave, and slave owners did not want their slave to be empowered. It would give them too much confidence, exactly the opposite of what we would say today. We want people to have confidence, but slave owners would have been threatened by a slave who had too much confidence. So Douglass, who was learning to read from his mistress, then suddenly was shut out of all of that. Now, he could have been devastated by that. He could have given up the opportunity, the possibility he would ever learn to read. Instead, he was resilient. Just like that elastic band, he bounced back. He turned that failure, now it wasn't his failure, but it was a lack of opportunity. He turned that adversity into a success because he decided, he was determined that he was going to learn to read. And he writes about this in his narrative. It's one of the most famous parts of the narrative. He said that hearing the slave owner say, "I don't want that young boy to learn to read," he realized, well, there must be some reason he doesn't want me to learn. He must realize how powerful knowledge is. And that just made Douglass even more determined that he was going to learn to read. So he bounced back. He had a growth mindset. He didn't despair. He didn't turn that into a permanent failure, to use Seligman's notion of thinking that way. Instead, he became resourceful as well as resilient. And he went out and found white boys who knew how to read, and he would coax them into giving him lessons. And then he worked and he worked and he worked until he not only knew how to read, he became a brilliant writer, one of the greatest writers of the 19th century, even though as a boy, he didn't even know how to read. That's resilience. That's bouncing back from an adversity and launching yourself forward.
Wonderful. What a wonderful guide, Frederick Douglass. And how does setting intentions for the new year help build resilience?
Setting intentions can make someone better in a number of different ways. So when we think about the new year, we often think about things like exercising more and eating better. But if you think about anything in your life that you could change, some people may recognize that they have trouble with resilience. They may recognize that they tend to personalize their failures with this explanatory style. They may realize that they tend to ruminate too much, that they're not truly reflecting, they're simply becoming fixated on something. Or they may recognize they have a fixed mindset when it comes to math or music or sports. So going back to that self-awareness you asked about, Sabrina, if you recognize those things, if you recognize those weaknesses, those the things that keep you from succeeding, you can resolve yourself into getting better at those things. So instead of thinking of New Year's resolutions only as things about exercise or going to school more or something like that, you can actually think about how you can become more resilient. And if you know some of these concepts that I've shared from psychology, or if you think about some of the things that Franklin and Douglass did, you can set up intentions, goals, resolutions in the new year that will help you to become more resilient. So let me give you an example. If you recognize through this self-awareness that we talked about earlier, that you have a bad habit of catastrophizing, of taking one little setback and turning it into something permanent that is going to be, that's going to hold you back for a long time. And then you think, that's not what Franklin did. That's not what Douglas did. That's not what I should do. Now you can turn that into an intention. You can turn it into a resolution. Perhaps you get into the habit of reflecting on a regular basis so that you're able to overcome that weakness. So resilience is something you can actually build. And this is not just my opinion. This is what the psychological research shows us, is that there is a genetic component. Some people tend to be more resilient than others, but you can build resilience. You can go about it in a very intentional way. And that's where you can set some New Year's resolutions so that you can overcome some of those weaknesses and become more resilient.
That's great. And looking back to the mirror, sometimes we often always see like our physical appearances, and we tend to look into our own failures only. And what does self-compassion play in bouncing back from these challenges and adversities that we have mentioned earlier on?
I think it goes back to that explanatory style I mentioned earlier. If you are self-aware enough to realize that you fall into these traps of ruminating, fixating on things that are wrong, making that something personal and internal and permanent, if you allow yourself to fall into those traps, then you have to figure out a way to overcome them and have some compassion for yourself, to realize that you weren't born a failure and will always be a failure. That's a fixed mindset. If you love yourself well enough that you give yourself a chance to improve, then you're going to give yourself that chance to improve. But you have to have enough compassion for yourself. You know, there's another psychological concept that I think is really fascinating here. It's called the ABCD model. And A is for adversity and so on. But the D is the one I want to focus on. D is disputation. And it's a fascinating idea, but it's a really powerful one. If someone you love is arguing with you about how they are worthless and they failed and that they're not lovable or they're not successful, you would probably argue against that person, right? You would say, no, you're catastrophizing. Don't be so hard on yourself. And yet we can do that to ourselves. We can be harder on ourselves than we are with somebody else. So the idea of disputation is when you catch yourself acting in that way, when you catch yourself ruminating, becoming negative and catastrophizing, dispute that belief about yourself just as you would with somebody arguing with you. Realize that you are catastrophizing, realizing that your logic is not very sound when you're beating yourself up about these things. Instead, use some disputation. Dispute that, because deep down and on an objective level, you can see that it's not true. But if you get caught in that catastrophizing and that rumination, then you wind up not seeing the reality outside of you. You need to find some way to dispute those beliefs about yourself. And that's where I think that self-compassion can be really powerful.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really interesting take, because sometimes we only see ourselves as first point of view, and disputing ourselves really puts us into the third person's perspective, where we, for example, where we talk to our best friend, we won't say these things. Or when we talk to our parents, when we talk to our siblings, we won't say these horrible things that we say to ourselves to them. So disputing is a really good idea, especially when people go and fall into, when people go and fall into these rumination stages. And looking back, what one lesson that have you learned from these literature that can be applied to our resolutions?
So we've been talking about resolutions. I'm going to quote from Franklin again. He said, "Resolve to perform what you must, perform without fail what you resolve." So in other words, you figure out that one thing and more than one thing, but let's say one thing at a time, you decide that you're going to be more resilient. So that's your resolution, but you have to follow through on it. And this is where I think a lot of people fall short in their New Year's resolutions. It's easy to set a new goal for yourself. Now, some goals are better than others, but you can set a goal And then you feel good that, okay, now I'm going to get better. Now I'm going to be more resilient. But you have to follow through. And that's why he says, perform without fail what you resolve. And that's the part where it helps to have a method. And Franklin actually had a method that he developed for this. It's a fascinating part of his autobiography. He wrote this in what we call part 2. He thought about some of the things that he wanted to achieve. He called it his project of arriving at moral perfection. And he actually literally made a list of 12 things that he was going to be better at. And one of them was resolution. That's where that quotation came from. Another one was industry in terms of working harder. And another one was order. He wanted to bring more order into his life. Now, there's a funny aspect of this. He shared the list with someone, the 12 virtues that he wanted to achieve. And his friend said, you need to add one, humility. So apparently Franklin had a reputation for not being very humble. So he made this list of things that he wanted to achieve. And then he had a method that he would intentionally work on that. So he was resolving these things, but then he was intentionally working on one at a time. And he actually put them in order, knowing that if he mastered temperance, then he would be, which is an old-fashioned way of saying not drinking or eating too much. If he mastered that, he would have a clear head to work on the next on his list. And he said you should work on just one at a time, just like a gardener would weed only one part of his garden at a time. You don't try to do it all at once. He said the same thing is true with these morals. I'm going to focus on just one at a time. So he had a method for achieving. And I think the same thing is true of resilience. You can set some SMART goals for yourself. So by SMART, that's an acronym that we use to be specific. So the goal should be specific and not just I'm going to be more resilient, but I'm going to have more self-compassion. I'm going to stop myself when I ruminate. I'm going to develop a growth mindset. That would be a more specific goal. M is for measurable. So you want to be able to see, have you actually done it? Achievable, A is for achievable. It's something you actually can do. You're not going to become resilient overnight or the most resilient person in the world or whatever. R is realistic. And then T is for time bound. So I would encourage people, if they're thinking about setting resolutions to be more resilient, think about specific things that they can do to make themselves more resilient, and then work on those things very deliberately and intentionally, as Franklin did.
That's great. Having SMART goals is really something that can keep us in track. And talking about keeping on track of our resolutions, of our goals, how do you measure your progress in becoming someone who is more resilient?
That's a great question. And it goes back to what I said earlier with the M being the measurable part of a SMART goal. If you don't know you're making progress, either you can despair thinking you're not making progress, or you might fool yourself into thinking you're making more progress than you really are. So you have to have some way of measuring that. Now, Franklin had a fascinating way that he did it, and he explained it in his autobiography. So in this same section where he talks about the 13 virtues that he's pursuing, temperance and order and so on, he explains, and he actually has a picture of it in his autobiography. So if you read the autobiography, you can actually see the picture of a grid. And the grid had each day of the week along the top, and then along the left-hand side, he had the various virtues he was working on. But he would only work on one at a time. So he would focus on the first week, he would focus on temperance. And he would mark with a little black dot where he had not been temperate. Same thing with silence and resolution and industry and humility. So for humility, for example, if he caught himself bragging, then he would give himself a little black dot to say that he messed up that day. So it's a clear, measurable way of tracking your progress. Now, I think it's brilliant, but there's a twist on this that I would encourage people to think about. There's a habit expert named B.J. Fogg, and he explains you're probably better off marking your successes, celebrating your successes. Because of the way the brain works, if you give yourself a little reward, and it could be something very simple like, a thumbs up to yourself, the way the brain works is that you're more likely to recognize that as a success and to celebrate that success and want to do more of it. So the advice that I give people is, instead of marking your errors, give yourself credit when you caught yourself ruminating and you stopped. Give yourself credit when you see a failure and try to learn from it. When you reflect on that failure and you try to use a growth mindset, and you reward yourself for doing that, and you'll probably find that you're able to do more and more of it and make a lot of progress on that goal of becoming more resilient.
I think what he has created, the grid, is quite similar to a bingo card, like a self-resilient bingo card that we reward ourselves after doing these habits or goals that he did, like, for example, temperance, because I did read a little bit of an excerpt from Frederick Douglass in terms of these grids. And I find that quite fascinating that in 19th century, someone has actually created this habit tracker, is what we call in nowadays term. And making the habit tracker actually creates a habit to do and check the habit tracker, and then checking ourselves back and going back to our topic, which is reflection. And how do you bounce back emotionally when you're going through major setbacks? Because not every day we can be someone who is, okay, I am good with my temperance today. I'm good with running for 5 kilometers today. But on other days, there are major setbacks in life. How about you, Mark? How do you encounter and how do you bounce back from these setbacks?
I think a lot of practice has helped me to bounce back from setbacks. As I said, everybody has setbacks. One of the ways you can develop better resilience, according to psychology, is to have better emotional regulation. So in other words, you don't let your emotions run away from you. Of course, we all have emotions and we will react emotionally to things. But if you don't let yourself get carried away with those emotions, then you're more likely to be able to be resilient about those things. So I found in my own life, I tend not to catastrophize. I tend not to get too emotionally wrought about things. I have emotions, but I'm able to kind of compartmentalize them. I'll never forget one time somebody asked me at the end of my day, so how was your day? And I literally couldn't remember my day at that point because at the end of the day, my job was over. I was ready to go home, relax, and start the next day over again. I think some of that is probably a blessing just because of the way that I'm wired in terms of my psychology. But also, I think that some of that just comes from a lot of experience and working through setbacks and teaching yourself not to become emotionally wrought over things.
Not letting yourself emotionally rot over things. That's a wonderful line here. And I'd like to know, how do you differentiate between if you're having a lesson in life or a mistake in life?
Sure. So I like to think of it like a Venn diagram. So not every mistake is a lesson, and not every lesson is a mistake. But if you think about a Venn diagram, many of our mistakes can be lessons if, to go back to our theme here, if you reflect on those things. And that's what Franklin, I think, did a great job of. He would reflect on things that he had done and think about a way that he could do them better in the future. In that sense, those errata that he wrote about could be lessons for him, and they also could be lessons for us. Sometimes you hear people say that you can learn from your own mistakes, but it's easier to learn from somebody else's mistakes. And that's what Franklin encouraged us to do when he wrote his autobiography. He would explain these mistakes that he made and then give us a chance to learn from those same mistakes. So I'll give you an example. He recognized early when he was young that he had a disputatious turn. In other words, he tended to want to try to correct people and argue with people. And at some point, he realized it wasn't very productive because nobody likes an argumentative person. In fact, he had a great line on this. He said that when people recognize you are disputatious, they're likely just to leave you undisturbed in your error, which is kind of a funny way of saying they're not going to try to correct you because they know you're not listening. All you want to do is argue. So Franklin turned that mistake into a lesson. He became enamored with something called the Socratic method, where Socrates' idea was that he was totally humble and he would simply ask questions. And at some point, Franklin realized that he could ask questions and not be so dogmatic in his opinions. And what he wound up doing is he taught himself to use words like, well, it seems to me, it appears to me, instead of words like certainly, it must be so. It seems like a very simple thing just to change your words. But when you listen to someone who says, certainly this is so, this must be so, you realize that they're not really very open to new ideas. And so people will leave you undisturbed in your error, so to speak. But if you're less dogmatic and you are more flexible about things, and you say, well, it seems to me this is true, or it seems apparent to me, could it be that this is true? Then people are more likely to engage with you in conversation. And after that, Franklin became extremely successful in communication. So again, he learned from that mistake. And that's what I think we can do for ourselves too. We turn those mistakes into lessons if we're willing to reflect on them objectively.
Being disputatious is something that I also personally am going from, because in the past I was someone who was quite argumentative, quite similar to Benjamin Franklin, as you mentioned. It is something that you should have to reflect yourself again and again. And for you, Mark, how often do you reflect on your life lessons?
Well, again, I'm reminded of something Franklin had built into his daily schedule. And I won't say I'm as regimented about this as Franklin is, but I do take time to reflect on what I've learned from the day. So at the end of the day, I might think about something that didn't go the way I thought it should. What can I learn from that? How could I do it differently? So in Franklin's autobiography, he has his time schedule of what he did at each time of the day. He would work and eat lunch and so on. And one of them was set aside for reflection. So it was called a daily examination, examine his day. And I think that would be a time in all of our lives, if we could set aside 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the end of the day to think back to the things that went well, and more importantly, the things that didn't go well. So if we made a mistake that day and we were sharp with our kids, well, you can't change the past, but you can change the future. So maybe you were too tough on your kid because you left the milk out and you got angry about it and you shouted at him and then he became upset and you realized you just made things worse. You can't change the past, but at the end of the day, as you're reflecting, you think, okay, next time, if I see something, I have to regulate my emotions, count to 10, take a deep breath. Literally, breathing deeply can help us to overcome some of those stress, the stress that is overwhelming us. That's a time for reflection that you can build into every day and try to learn from things that didn't go so well so that you don't repeat those mistakes in the future.
Creating this times with another day sounds simple in theory. It's only 5 minutes, but a lot of people are, I'm too tired for work. I'm too tired and I don't want to do anything. I just want to go to bed and I don't want to do anything else. And I've been typing the whole day. And how can we create a habit of reflection to enhance our personal resilience, especially when ourselves, humans, are resilient to change?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sabrina. I would offer a couple of pieces of advice. One is that the end of the day is probably the best time to do it. Maybe not right before you go to bed because you might fall asleep before you finish your self-examination. Mm-hmm. But the later in the day, the more time you have to reflect on. So if you're able to try it, and one of the techniques of habit formation is to start small. So if you I'm just going to reflect for 1 minute, and then I'm not going to require myself to do anything else. I'm just going to reflect for 1 minute. Well, everybody can reflect for 1 minute. And so maybe you do that at a certain time of day. This is something else that the habit experts tell us. It's called habit stacking. So maybe you do it while you're brushing your teeth. So you already have a habit of brushing your teeth. Just about everybody brushes their teeth before they go to bed. Maybe that's a time so you don't forget to do it. When you brush your teeth, you're reflecting on what happened over the course of the day. If that works for you, then you're going to get a little bit of reflection in. But here's the beauty of habits. When you succeed in it for a week, it becomes easier for you to do it the next week. And after a while, you find that you really are reflecting for a full 5 minutes. Now, the other thing I would say is that if people just find that they're not able to do that day after day, you can do your reflection earlier in the day. In fact, in some ways, it might be better to reflect 2 or 3 times throughout the day. So if you find that you're too tired at the end of the day to do your reflection, maybe you find a way to build that in earlier in the day so that at lunch, when you're still probably fairly alert and you're about to eat your lunch, right before you sit down to eat, maybe you just take a minute and think about the morning and things that went well and things that you could improve on. That would be an opportunity to reflect and improve as well.
Yeah, Mark. We have been talking about habit stacking and the great from Frederick Douglass and a lot of different how our mind works in terms of rumination and reflection. And how are you personally, Mark, have been using these habits or using these ways in incorporating these life lessons and making your life into a better life?
Well, I use a lot of habits, and I can give an example of how I have used it in terms of improving, in terms of reflection. So I find, and I don't do this deliberately. Some of my habits I do pursue deliberately. But one thing I've noticed about myself is that I have almost like a knee-jerk reaction of reflecting on something when something goes wrong. And it could be something simple like I misplaced my keys. My mind immediately, it's kind of weird how it happens. My mind immediately goes to, how can I not make this happen again? So that's a kind of reflection that happens in the moment. And then what I do is I set a rule for myself. I think, well, if I only allow myself to put my keys in one place, I literally will never forget them, because the reason you lose your keys, you put them someplace where you didn't expect to put them. So if I only allow myself to put keys at one place, then I'm not likely to make the mistake again. So that's how I apply some of that to my own life. I tend to set rules for myself that I know will help me to be better in the future. And I think that applies to resilience as well. If you catch yourself ruminating, you set a goal for yourself or set a rule for yourself that the minute you say something negative about yourself, you stop yourself and you dispute that and say, wait a second, here I go again. I'm beating myself up about something. I know this is a bad habit of that I have. I'm going to stop right now and think about something totally different, or I'm going to try to say something positive about myself. So setting rules for yourself can be a really powerful way of breaking the circuitry that is making you do the catastrophizing or other things that are going to lead you down a negative road.
Yeah, setting these rules to yourselves. And how can we set these rules to all ourselves? And what are the practices or routines that help you stay resilient during this difficult times, especially when you're going through an emotional setback?
Well, you're right to mention an emotional setback, because those can be the hardest ones to overcome, because then our emotions take over. I'll never forget, I was listening to a speaker many years ago, and she said, and she's talking about how the brain works. She said that we feel before we think. And that's not just speculation. That really is how the brain works. When the signals go through that deep part of the reptilian part of your brain, before it gets to the executive functions in your neocortex, you automatically have this emotional reaction to something. And what she was encouraging us to think about is how that feeling happens first, but we have to take a deep breath and let the executive functions in the more thinking part of our brain reflect, think productively and constructively of how we can overcome that. So that's the part of the emotional regulation I think we all need to do, is when we catch ourselves feeling strongly, that's probably, especially if it's something negative, you could be heading down the wrong road at that point. And that's when you have to literally take a deep breath, maybe count to 10. And before you do something that's counterproductive, you allow your executive functions in your neocortex to take over and reflect on whether that's really the best course of action. One thing I like to think about is playing things out. A mentor I had years ago, we would talk about things and he would say, well, let's play this out. And what he meant by that is, if we do X, then what's going to happen next? X, Y, Z. Wait a second. When you play it out, you realize, I don't want Z happening. So you back up and think, I probably shouldn't do X. Now, we can't always predict the future. But if we know, for example, and take the example earlier, that when we're angry with our children and we scold them, then they react negatively and things get worse, then thinking ahead to the next time, you realize, okay, if I play this out, if I shout at the child, then the child's going to become even more upset, won't trust me, destroy the relationship. So you play that out. And that's something that I think can be really effective. Again, I'll give you a quick example from Benjamin Franklin. I mentioned that he traveled across the ocean. He gets stuck there. Governor Keith didn't come through with what he promised. Mm-hmm. So Franklin lands on his feet and he goes to work for a printing house there. Well, while he's there, he has to pay a little due for it's called a sum for drink, bienvenue. He has to pay this due. So he does, no problem. Well, then he gets moved to a different part of the shop. And the workers there say, you need to pay your due. And he said, well, I already paid it. Well, they weren't satisfied with that, and they started sabotaging his work. Well, he was right, and the boss said he was right. He'd already paid, but he played it out in his mind and realized, if I don't pay this due, even though I'm in the right, if I don't pay it, they're going to continue to sabotage my work. I'm not going to get along with these guys. I'm not going to do well in my job, and things aren't going to go well. So he did what a lot of people would not do. He paid the fee. He knew he was right, but as he said, he realized that there was some folly, there was some foolishness in being on ill terms with someone that you're forced to live with continually. So that's a good example of playing things out before you make a decision that's going to hurt not only other people, but may actually hurt you.
Yeah. And I feel like that is something like taking a step backwards to just do a reflections and in our life in general, for example, not just journaling, because a lot of people think that the practice that we have to constantly do is reflecting by journaling. But the step going into journaling is actually reflecting inside our minds and taking a step back in situations where especially our emotions are arising, and sometimes it's a bit hard to have the ability to just breathe.
I think it can be very difficult. I'm glad you mentioned journaling, Sabrina, because I think some people will find that that is a good way to work through some of these setbacks that they've had over the course of the day. So we talked a few minutes ago about reflection at the end of the day. And as you pointed out, some people might feel that they're too tired or whatever. You have to figure out what works for you. So if writing out your day is the way that you reflect on it, that's a really effective method. It doesn't have to be journaling. My daughter does bullet journaling, which is kind of a shortened form of journaling. You figure out what works for you. As I said, for me, I keep a journal, but it's a very boring journal. I really don't do much reflection in it. My reflection goes on up here in my head. So for me, it might be a matter of thinking about things at the end of the day before I go to bed about what I've learned over the course of the day. For other people, it might be journaling. For other people, it might be conversation. They have a conversation with their spouse or their loved one about what went well that day or what didn't. But it's really important that people try to figure out what works for them. And journaling might be an effective method for some people for reflection.
Well, we really just had an insightful conversation with Mark, and that bullet journaling is something that some people can think about doing and start doing in terms of reflecting themselves, because a lot of people think journaling is writing a whole entire page, 2 pages. And I feel like that's a good conclusion to our main topic of today. And now we can go into our open mic segment where you can talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. So Sabrina, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. This is actually related to our topic, and that is something I'm passionate about, which is using reflection on literature and history and ideas and art, all of the things that I love. I want people to think about ways that they can elevate their lives. I am a passionate believer, just as Franklin was, and just as Douglas was, in the ability for people to change their lives for the better. So in the world of literature, sometimes we talk about whether people have free will or not. I believe people have free will, and they can use that will to make good decisions to improve their lives. But a lot of that comes through reflection on what they've read, what they've seen, and literature is a great source of that kind of reflection. So as I said in my learning platform, Mind Inclined, you can tell from the title, where my daughter and I work on this project together. We're helping people to incline their minds to be better reflectors on their experiences and figure out ways that they can elevate their minds, their lives, and really elevate the whole world when we all think constructively, reflectively about how we can make things better. That's what makes me very passionate.
Yeah, Mark, you're really doing wonderful, wonderful work out there, because you're creating wonderful minds out there and making these people breaking their boundaries that they set for themselves, like these invisible barriers that they're trying to break. And every listener wants to, and if our listener wants to listen and know more about you and find you, where should they go?
Well, thank you for asking. They can go to mindinclined.org. And there they will find ways that they can subscribe to my Mind Travel newsletter. It comes out every Saturday. It's free. And I reflect on Benjamin Franklin, Frederick Douglass, lots of other thinkers, Thomas Jefferson, and the Declaration of Independence. In addition to being a literature professor, I teach a lot of language. And so I have some suggestions for how people can use language effectively. I also have a podcast called Ring the Bell, which is available on YouTube. And it's also available through mindinclined.org. The title comes from the idea that at the circus, if you go there and you swing the hammer to try to ring the bell, I remember learning a long time ago, it's not just about how hard you swing it, it's about where you swing it. So ring the bell is about using your efforts, but also being smart in your efforts. And so it's a 1-minute YouTube short that comes out from time to time with suggestions for how you can do things to improve your lives, for everything from as simple as learning how you can memorize people's names, learn names more quickly, to ways that you can improve your life on a more global level. So all those are available from mindinclined.org, and I hope people will check it out and subscribe for free.
Thank you very much, Mark, for coming and sharing about mindinclined.org and about your wonderful insights on Benjamin Franklin and Frederick Douglass, the habit tracker, and all of these historical figures and literatures so that we can build our lives into a better person. And that is all, everyone. Thank you for joining in today's episode, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.
You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.